Hello, everybody, and happy new comic book day. Welcome to the newest episode of That's Comical. As always, I am Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome, and I'd like to welcome you to the second half, so to speak, of the monthly segment of That's Comical here on my channel. And I am also even more excited to introduce my second partner in this venture. It's nice to know that along with my other brand new show that just launched, The Old, the New, and the Awesome, that there are two partners working with me on that show. So it's good to say that things do come in threes that are positive, even though unfortunately when we say things come in threes, sometimes it can be negative, especially when it comes to celebrity passings. So far, we've officially in these past couple of days have had two, the great Hank Aaron and the legendary Larry King. So people are wondering who that third person is going to be. But enough about that. That's not why we're here today. We're here to talk about comic books, and I would like to take this opportunity to introduce my second friend who has joined me on this venture. Now, he is not as old of a friend as Dan is, everybody. Dan has been my childhood friend. This is actually someone who I've only met very recently, but there's a very interesting reason as to why. So this is because a couple of years ago, it was back in 2017, I ended up meeting one of my fellow YouTube colleagues in person. And you, if you are members of the BookTube community who follow me, you know her as Blatantly Bookish. So I met her, and my wife met her, and we also happened to meet her significant other at the time, who is now her proud husband. So let me just take no more time in talking and introduce my very good friend, Andy. And I just want to say, Andy, thank you so much for joining me and Dan on this awesome brand new chapter in my, and our now, YouTube adventures.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you for having me, Steve. I don't know what more I have to add, at least at this point. I know today we're going to be talking a lot about our backgrounds and our personal stories. So look, I'm Andy. It's really great to be here. And I'm looking forward to getting through our discussion. And also, again, thank you. I think this is going to be a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to a great year of doing these.
Well, I am so thrilled that you are able to join me. And more importantly, I'm excited for every single one of you who have been watching today, as well as if you've watched episode 1. So if you do like this video, don't forget to leave a comment as well as a thumbs up. And if you want to watch more of what goes on over here, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification button so you are up to date with all our latest content. So this specific segment in our show is a little bit different from what I do with Dan. Dan and I, we basically do a wrap-up of the month that was. We talk about the more recent comic books that we've read, what we like, what we didn't like. This specific segment is more of a topical show. So before we get into the actual topic of our launching episode here, let's talk about what you will be expecting on this segment of That's Comical. So I've decided to come up with 3 specific topics. One of them is going to be called Must Be Read. The reason why I chose that is because there's a lot of you who are out there that really are starting to get a lot of interest in comic books and the comic book community. But the hardest thing when it comes to comic books is, where do I start? There's over 80 years worth of stories. So Andy and I, and maybe even Daniel will show up once or twice, we're going to talk to you guys about a story, whether it's past or present, that we both truly believe is one of the greatest and you really should take the time to read. Another topic will be creator's notes. That is when we're going to dedicate an entire episode to a comic book character, be it hero, villain, or anything in between, as well as maybe even a writer or even an artist, because some of us comic book faithful do like to buy our comics and read our comics based on the people that write them and the people that draw them. That's a very big staple in the comic book community. And the third and final topic that will be on this show will be what we're discussing today, and it's called the Topics 3, where we're basically going to be taking a specific topic, whether it's a controversial one or just one that a lot of people like to talk about, but we want to give our own perspective on. And the fact that Andy is wearing a Thor t-shirt means he probably got the reference, which makes me very, very happy. So The topic today is called our comic book origin stories, because I think it is important to know, how did we get into the reading of comic books, the collecting of comic books, or just everything that you get in comic books in general. So I've just got a couple of questions, and I'm going to just throw them out at Andy, and he's going to answer them, and then I'm going to give you guys my own perspective and take on those as well, because the thing that makes me so happy is our comic book origin stories, so to speak, are very different from each other. So I think that's what's going to make this a very interesting topic of discussion. So I hope you're ready, Andy.
I sure am. Yeah, looking forward to it.
All right.
So we can dive right in wherever you want to start, Steve.
All right, of course. So the first question that I want to ask is, what was your first exposure to comic books, or even just superheroes in general?
Yeah, so I'll start off, and the big thing, and this will come up a lot while talking about my early exposure and how I got into comics, all that sort of thing, is really, it's all through my dad. My dad is a huge comics fan, and knows, admittedly, openly, more about comics, especially Golden Age, Silver Age comics, than I ever will. So I got into comics through him, getting into like superhero exposure. You know, some of my earliest memories are watching, you know, things like the Batman animated series, which I mean is obviously comics adjacent, though that isn't the issues themselves. And my dad has a huge comics collection, and in addition to his actual physical like books from when he was younger and collecting comics from an early age, he also has a lot of collections, trade paperbacks. So some of my oldest comic memories are, I mean, the first thing that I think of is when I was a little kid, my dad would read me bedtime stories out of like a Golden Age Batman collection. And so that's really how I got into comics. Batman specifically, but probably DC as a result is where I kind of started, because as I got introduced to the characters through the Batman stories, you know, the wider world, yeah, I knew, you know, Marvel and other publishers over time. But my origin, that's really heavy DC, and in particular, heavy Batman.
Well, I gotta tell you, those are one hell of a series of bedtime stories to get as a young kid at night. I mean, I got little golden books and Disney books and Berenstain Bears from my mother. My dad works really hard and always has as far back as I can remember. So he never really had the opportunity to really read me a bedtime story. But yeah, that makes me a little bit jealous. I'm not gonna lie right there. But
I'll tell you, Bob Kane is pretty different from Golden Books. So. So it explains a lot about me when you hear that.
Yeah, I think the only way that could possibly cross those over is if Mark Hamill ever decided to do a Joker voice reading of The Little Engine That Could. I think that would get a lot of comic book fans really excited.
Yeah, I feel you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. My comic book origin story and superheroes are very different from yours. I mean, I still, to a certain degree, I'm never going to be angry about this, but I wish that one of my parents was someone who shared some kind of a passion towards something that I truly enjoy. Now, it's not to say that I don't get along with my parents, but I'm one of 3 kids, and I was always the one that sort of stood out because I was more of someone who was into things like movies and music and stuff like that. Not to say that my entire family isn't, but they're not as passionate or go into deeper layers and levels like I do. Like, I love to analyze in a music. I like to analyze a band's musicianship and artistic style, and I like to analyze lyrics sometimes. Like, people in my family don't go that deep. They just listen to the music. They like the music. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's just the way some people are in this world. But comic books, my dad has told me that he was not a big comic book collector, but his older brother, my uncle, was. The problem was, and people hear this story way too many times, they were victims of, we went away to camp one summer, and when we came back, our stuff was gone.
Oh, yeah, I know that story. And I'll tell you, and look, Steve, you and I have talked offline about this too. So I said my dad has a fantastic comic collection, and he's been reading books for a long time. He's got some incredibly breathtaking things on his shelf. He does have a similar-ish story. I know that at one point, a certain portion of his collection was gotten rid of while he was out of the house one day. But I mean, I just try to not think about what was possibly in that collection and focus on what he still has and let that kind of give me the hope and the joy.
Yeah, I didn't get the graphic details of the comic books, but when my dad told me about the baseball cards that he used to have, oh God, Mickey Mantle cards.
It's this face. Anyone who knows collector stuff, anyone who does the collector thing has that same reaction. And the good thing about, with me and where I came from and how I owe so much of my fandom and my nerd culture and all of that stuff to my dad is I dodged all of that. I have too much shit. So I have the storage unit full of stuff. I got this apartment full of stuff. I mean, even just behind me, I have on my shelf here, none of this is like super old or anything, but it's like all stuff that's like from my dad's world. I got a bunch of like rock related books down here, Beatles stuff that was actually a gift from him, like various Star Wars and things like that. Just your general like kind of nerd culture stuff. I've never faced in my entire life any pressure to get rid of any of that stuff. Yeah. Primarily because my dad knows don't risk it. Is saving a little bit of shelf space is not worth the heartache in 30 years when you find out that thing is now worth $10,000.
Yeah. And God willing, when the days that we are finally able to get together again in person outside of the pandemic, I know that this is something that you and your father said to me on the night of your wedding, when I got to introduce myself to your parents, that he does want me one day to see some of these comics that he's not like. The fact that your father has the comics that you mentioned to me, it's like I've just always wanted to not necessarily own one of those specific books, but just bask in the glory of its presence.
I know.
See it. That's what it is. But superheroes actually came to me at a younger age, probably around like 2 or 3. And that was where I have to thank my mother, because my mother introduced me to 2 wonderful things when I was a kid. She introduced me to the Super Friends from Hanna-Barbera, and she also introduced me to the 1966 Adam West Batman show. So that was my first exposure to superheroes. And I had the Superpowers action figures from 1983, and I had the Batmobile, I had the Hall of Justice. That was my real getting into superheroes and stuff. And I also had a Spider-Man doll and whatnot. Like, I didn't really know anything about, what is the various companies that each of these characters belong to. But what's kind of funny is, I don't even know if I'm even making this up or if there was even an idea in my head, but I always actually said to myself, why does Spider-Man not meet with Superman? Like, what's going on here? I don't understand. Yeah. And it wasn't until I got a little bit older until I learned, like, Marvel superheroes, DC superheroes. So then I was starting to get a little bit of an understanding of the companies, but I never did go into the area of reading the comic books. Like, I always knew that they were comic books, but I never actually bought them myself. And it wasn't until I was in 4th grade, I had a friend who is unfortunately not my friend anymore due to a falling out that we had after college, not something that we're going to discuss today, but he was a comic book reader. And I was exposed to the comic books because around that time, that was when I started to learn a little bit more about other characters, like the X-Men and the Fantastic Four. Like, I knew bits and pieces, but I didn't know about the entirety of the Marvel and DC superhero worlds. So he showed me a couple of these comics, and he also told me that there's something really cool happening right now. There's this big story called Executioner Song happening in the world of X-Men. And that is going to lead into the second question that I want to open up here. And that is, do you remember the very first comic book that you ever read?
So I was thinking about that because, you and I kind of talked a little bit about what we might be chatting about today. And it's really hard for me to think what the first one is. And interestingly enough, I think that's because, and today's really driving it home for me, Steve, you and I have very different paths with comics in that I can't remember a time where I didn't have the fabric of like DC and Marvel in my head, because my first exposure to all this stuff was the actual comic books from my dad, like some of my earliest memories. You actually are a lot more connected to ongoing series than I am these days. We kind of pass. It's like you started with some of the outside media and then landed in the books. I started with the books, and now I'm a little bit more kind of in the expanded universe, like books and movies and games kind of part of it, right?
Mhm.
But anyway, all of this is to say, I'm not sure what the first book would be, because I know that it's like Golden and Silver Age Batman. I do, however, remember a little bit about like first books that I read myself. The first one that I picked off the shelf to read to myself completely on my own was like, and this is going to be very funny, I think it was Year One.
Oh wow, really? You
Which
really went to the Frank. Wow, you went to the darker side right
I
at an early
I
age.
do, yeah, no, diving right in, no
Wow, right
breaks.
into Frank Miller. Wow, that's
Yeah, no,
impressive.
my dad had, I mean, my dad being a Frank Miller fan, as is like almost everybody, you know, those were among the collection. I think what stood out to me, maybe it was something about the art of the books. I'm not entirely sure why, or maybe it's the draw of like an origin story. And look, Batman's origin has been told so many times. Also, by the way, it feels funny to be sitting here talking about Batman as much as I have, while I know I'm wearing my Thor Marvel shirt. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's probably what the draw was there. So while it definitely wasn't the first comic story I ever read or was exposed to, the earliest memory I have of picking one up completely on my own, albeit from my dad's shelf, this is
Right.
not a going to a store story yet, is probably Year One.
When I actually speak to some people in the YouTube world and they like listening to me talk about comics, because I only started talking about them very recently on my channel, like every single month when I was doing my monthly updates, and your wife knows these well because she's watched a few of them.
Mm-hmm.
I would show off some of the recent comics that I was reading, and people really liked that. And some people were saying, like, where do I begin with some of these heroes? And I actually suggested The Dark Knight Returns from
Yeah.
Frank Miller, but then there were a bunch of people that actually said that may not be the best place to start just because of how dark it is.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you know what? It really goes in two different directions for many different people.
Yeah, and also I think it's really interesting with the question where to start with comics, just because nerd culture has become pop culture, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of content on the internet about modern nerd, geek, whatever you call it, stuff that's obsessed with things like timeline, you know, things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or even things like the machete order of Star Wars versus release order of Star Wars, right?
Oh, yeah.
So like a lot of people, when they get interested in individual things, they want to know, well, where do I start? Do I start with Batman #1? And the answer, I think, unlike most other things in geek culture, is unequivocally no.
Right.
There's, you know, that's not where to start. The idea is there's a lot of different story arcs. You kind of want to have a conversation about what are you into? What are you hoping to get out of this? What about the character from your exposure without reading the books is of interest to you? Did you like a TV show? Did you like a movie? Like, do you like an art style? I mean, there's all these different questions about where to start. But I think with comics across the board, not to just use the example of Batman, there's very few like characters or stories where my immediate answer is issue 1, except for like Ms. Marvel.
Yeah. Well, I'm
But
glad that, no, I'm so glad you brought that up. And that's just because of the fact that the style of the comic book writing skill has changed dramatically,
oh
because
yeah,
you can read some golden and silver age books, but the thing about them is they're not always those ongoing stories.
right.
It really wasn't until now. People who are watching this, you can probably say that this might be inaccurate, but I think it might be. I truthfully feel that it really wasn't until the late 70s when Chris Claremont came to Marvel and started writing the X-Men stories, because when he started writing the X-Men, he started to create a little bit more of a continuity timeline within the stories as
Right.
the issues were coming out. Because then you had the Dark Phoenix saga, even before that you had the Phoenix saga, but they connected. And then you had Days of Future Past, and then you get into the 1980s, And DC pretty much says, okay, we're changing our whole way of storytelling with a little story called Crisis on Infinite Earths, because people are starting to say, well, this continuity just doesn't make sense. So that's why I'm blessed to say that I am a product of the 80s, because the 80s, when it comes to popular culture and creativity, that's really where things just started to run wild. I mean, in the 70s, you had the creation of the film blockbuster, and you had the people like Francis Ford Coppola, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Martin Scorsese. They basically knocked the door down. But when the 80s came into play, every creator that was in the 80s just tore the door off his hinges and ran with it. And that's when we got a lot of interesting things changing. And then when Image Comics came on the scene, then the big two really started to take their craft seriously in terms of trying to find so many ways to keep those readers coming back for more, because you're not done with this story yet. And now there are some people that are saying they're kind of upset with all of that, because that's all these comics
There's so much
right now.
continuity.
It's like they're literally creating a 5 to 6 issue story arc for the purposes of selling them in a paperback at Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com. So it's sort of a blessing and a curse all at the same time. But that's where I'm going with that, because, like, you don't need to go to the Golden Age and Silver Age to get started. But if you want to see a real history lesson in comic books, you know, that's a great way to go. I mean, if I ever was able to read Flash on Two Worlds, you know, the infamous beginning of the development of the DC multiverse, you know, that would just be a cool historic piece to read.
Yeah. And look, comics continuity can be its own episode, right?
Oh, for sure.
It's crazy. There's a lot of opinions on it. You know, you just think about it. It reveals layers in the stories you're reading. Sometimes it's contrived. I mean, like, how many years ago was it that Batman heard, which of the 3 Jokers do you want to hear about? But like, look, they seed things, and that's where you get some of the pressure, right? Because if you're trying to suggest to someone where should they start, and you suggest with a certain story, we can chase our tails for a long time and say, well, that story's great, but like, maybe you want to read these 5 issues from a series that came 2 years before, because they kind of lay the seeds for this like one scene in the comic or whatever. But then if you're reading that, you might want to read this one from a year prior by a different author. Putting that aside, because comics continuity is insane. And I think the average person is starting to learn more about that from things like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I mean, what the hell is going on with WandaVision? But like
I don't know. I don't have Disney Plus. I'm not watching it.
My lips are sealed then. But I think let me put it this way. I think the new or casual comic fan is starting to learn nobody's ever actually really gone. But it's, you know, like I said, it could be its own topic on comic continuity. But just separate from that, the quality of the individual stories, whether you're diving into the crazy mythos that's in the background that sets up all of these stories or not, you know, that's something people always want to know. Where to start? Just what's a good story? And I know that's stuff we're going to talk about throughout the year too.
Yeah, and I'm a victim of that kind of a circumstance. I mean, you know, my grand adventure on Blackest Night.
I do.
And
I was part of trying to help you complete it. I didn't do as good a job as I would have liked, but I tried.
But I did. Even scoring some original copies of Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is pretty much where the Blackest Night story really begins.
Right. And we've talked about that. And that's that thing where you just breadcrumb back and back and back. And it's like, I got to read all of this before I can enjoy what I'm trying to read.
But man, some of those stories were so good. Like I loved Infinite Crisis. I loved Identity Crisis. I loved The Circle of Fire, which was a great Kyle Rayner story, because Kyle Rayner's always been my favorite Green Lantern. So it was really great to see him become the last Green Lantern at the time, and then really develop into the hero that he was supposed to be, until Jeff Johns came around and created Green Lantern Rebirth, and then started us down the path of Blackest Night and Brightest Day, etc. But to answer the question that we started this whole talking topic on, which is not a bad thing, the first comic books I ever read were actually Executioner's Song, parts 1, 2, and 3. I heard about that from my friend from elementary school. Yeah, there you
This
go.
look familiar, probably?
Oh, yeah, it looks very familiar. I gave that to you. But anyway, the reason why my interest was on the X-Men at the time was because it was the early 90s and the X-Men animated series just hit the airwaves.
Yep.
So, and I was obsessed with Wolverine and Gambit and Jubilee and Beast. Like, I wanted to get them. So I went to my local comic book store, and that's going to be our next topic. And I just want to let everybody know that these are not the original 3 that I bought, but I picked up at the same time, simultaneously, Executioner Songs Parts 1, 2, and 3. So that was when I got my first Uncanny X-Men comic, my first X-Factor comic, and my first X-Men Series 2 comic. And of course, I opened up the sealed bag so I could read the books, and that will be another part of the comic book origin story, if you will, a little bit later down the line. But I bought all 12 as they came out, and I read them, and little by little, my comic book collection started to grow. And that leads into the third question, and that is, what were your very first impressions of your local comic book shop? Or did you have one? Or I don't know. We never actually had this conversation, so that's why I'm really excited to ask this question.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely had one. The interesting thing is the comic series that I followed growing up, most of them I did mail subscription of. So I didn't purchase a lot of current comics from the store. I got most of them delivered to me. I was reading ongoing Batman, ongoing Robin, trying to think what the ongoing series were that I was getting delivered. But nevertheless, the question of the comic shop, there was a comic shop near me. So I'm in Westchester, New York, right? So anyone who happens to be from the area will definitely remember Dragon's Den in Yonkers. That was definitely my local shop. You know, most of the time it was the kind of thing like while at the mall, I would want to stop there just to see what they had, even if I wasn't buying ongoing series from them. That's also where I got a lot of my exposure to things that I consider comics adjacent, because they would sell a lot of things like model kits, toys, and importantly for me and my background, a lot of import stuff, including anime and video games and manga. So that was kind of my experience. And Dragon's Den was that community. I mean, including things like, you know, they would do weekly card tournaments, whether it was like Friday Night Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh! Like it's that kind of community that it created. And it was a place that growing up, I always wanted to stop in whenever I could, even if I wasn't there exclusively for the ongoing series.
When you mentioned Westchester, I'm pretty sure a whole bunch of X-Men fans watching this just lit up in excitement. I mean, look,
yeah, no.
I'm a comic book fan when it comes to locations in New York City. I am their practical wet dream, because I currently live in Westchester, but I was born and raised in Queens.
Right.
So X-Men and Spider-Man fans, rejoice.
Yeah, no, I know very fondly, thinking back on some of the earliest exposure to X-Men, how incredibly cool I thought it was as a kid that, you know, that it's Westchester. It says it like on the sign on the door. It was very cool. And it's also very funny to see how writers who live their lives in New York City conceive of Westchester as this like sprawling green like countryside.
It can be. Depends on where you go.
Yeah.
I see that. I do see those wide open spaces.
Well, you're a little further north than me. You know, me growing up like really closer to the Bronx and like Yonkers, like it's a different. I mean, those places exist, don't get me wrong, but it was very funny as a little kid saying Westchester. I ain't what Westchester looks like, but whatever. It was super cool.
Yeah, it's because you live in the area where you mentioned Yonkers. That almost became New York's 6th borough.
Right.
So there's a reason as to why you say what you just said. But so I used to have a local comic book shop about 20 blocks away from my house, and I still remember the name. It was called Memory Bank 2, because the first original Memory Bank was in a different area in Queens. It was actually two sisters that owned both the stores. And unfortunately, in the late 90s, the one near my house actually closed down because the sister that was managing the one on the other side of Queens, unfortunately, died in a car accident.
Mm-hmm.
So the sister who was running my local store had to shut her branch down so she could manage the original store. And I don't know if that store is even still standing, but I just remember her being one of the sweetest, kindest people and always saving something for me that she knew I was interested in, because before I started to collect the comic books, I was collecting Marvel and DC cards. So I was collecting a lot of that stuff. So that's how I was really getting to know a lot more about the heroes and the villains that resided in the pages of these books. And the first time that I walked into that actual comic store, I wasn't actually looking for a comic book. I was looking for Garfield books. So I said to myself, you know, Garfield is comic, you know, but I didn't understand the difference between a comic book and a comic strip.
Got it, yeah.
So she was very kind. She said, unfortunately, you're looking in the wrong place, dear. You got to go to a bookstore to find the Garfield books.
Got it.
But when I got into comic books and cards, I went right back to the store, and I was there almost all the time. I think one of the few things that I loved so much about that store were two very fond memories of my life. This woman had on the top shelves, like very close to the entryway of the store, there were always these very sought after books, and they were not extremely expensive, but they were definitely priced in the way that young kids could not come in with that kind of money all the time and say, I'd like a copy of that. But the one comic that she had, and it was there for months, was an issue of Spawn #1, first printing. Her name was Vicky, wonderful woman. I said, Vicky, one day I am going to come into your store and I'm going to say, I would like to buy that comic book. And she said to me, the day that comes in, I will be very happy to know that you achieved your goal. And it took me a couple of months, but it was, I can't remember, it was because I did very well on my series of tests to end the school year. I know it was because I did something good in school. So my parents gave me some money as a gift. So I went to the store with the money and I said to her, Vicky, hi, I'd like a copy of Spawn #1, please. And I still remember her expression. She was like, she clapped. She said, oh, I'm so proud of you. You got it. You finally achieved it. So she pulled it down and she gave it to me. And just having that comic in my hands, it was one of the most amazing feelings of my life. Because it wasn't just getting that one comic book. It was just knowing that I earned it. That's what made me really happy. And the other thing that I loved so much about her store was she actually, towards the last couple of years before the store closed down, she had massive bins of dollar books. And you'd be very amazed what you would find in those bins. I found some chapters of Nightfall in there. I found a couple of #1s from Image. Like, that's how I got my hands on the Max #1 and Wildcats #1 and Youngblood #1. And I was able to pay such a good price for some of those books. So when I was a little kid, I was more so into the collecting rather than the actual reading of the book. So I always said to myself, you know, #1s, big, big, big. So that's basically where I was in regards to collecting those comic books. But also, what's so interesting is when I went and took a look at my collection in recent years, and I believe you were present for some of those times, and you loved coming over and checking out my books.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to know that at one point in time it was just one box, and at this point in time it's 10 boxes, which is kind of crazy. But when I found out that there were so many people that, you know, were talking about some of these great stories, and I'm like, you know, I do have that actual original book, and they're like, how did you get your hands on that? And I'm like, well, I got it off the shelf when it first came out. I mean, I still think, and I think it might have refueled my collecting of comic books, is because I picked up Kingdom Come by Mark Waid and Alex Ross in 1996. On the days each of these 4 issues came out. It was because I was an Alex Ross fan. I was like, I wanted to read this book, and I loved this story, and I just bought it for the sake of loving it. But now when I find out that this book is like one of the most sought after when it comes to their original printings, I was like, Wow. It's like those older people that like see their copy of X-Men 1 or Journey into Mystery 83, the first appearance of Thor. You know,
Yeah.
it's just like, I just bought this because I wanted to buy this when I was a kid.
Well,
I never would
yeah.
have imagined this.
Well, being a collector and collecting doesn't come just from the act of collecting. It's because you're a fan of the content and the stories. And so people have stories like that. You don't buy Kingdom Come when it's new because you think this is going to be worth something someday. You buy it because you love it. Alex Ross fan, into the story, want to have it, and then you keep it because you don't get rid of the things that give you joy. And so, like, you know, we talk a lot about like collection and how much something is worth. The thing is, these things are worth something to us in a vacuum with the dollar signs put away, right? So
Exactly.
that's how these collections start.
Exactly.
And that's why we have these wonderful things to hold up.
Yeah, I think when it comes to collecting, as far as I'm concerned for myself now, it's less about the monetary value and more so towards the nostalgia value and the collector's value and the sentimental value. I think it's a much stronger bond between people and their collections. That's why it's like, I'm buying these. Yes, I know they're worth a lot of money, but I'm never going to sell them because I just want to keep these. It's like when I keep going on to the internet and I keep finding out that my 4-piece Funko Pop box set of the Yellow Submarine Beatles is now approaching $700 in monetary value. I'm like, I'm still not getting rid of it. I'm keeping this. I'm a Beatles fan.
Yeah. And I mean, it goes both directions too, right? So like there's stuff that you get that like doesn't increase in value or has been in existence for a long time. You can still, I mean, like the thing that jumps to mind is, you know, you just helped me get a good deal on this. So I got Sandman issue 50 recently.
Right.
Look, 90s stuff getting printed to all hell, not a lot of value in these books. There's a jillion of them out there, even something sought after like this, which is a classic Neil Gaiman story, and that I picked up because it's one of my absolute favorites, and Neil Gaiman is probably my favorite author. Comics, novels, all that together. You know, I have that not because it was $5 now and maybe it'll be $20 in 10 years, but I have it because this is my favorite story from my favorite writer, and it has meaning to me to have an original copy of it that I can hold.
Yeah, that's why we got to get you a copy of Spawn #9, because I just literally had no idea that Neil Gaiman wrote that issue.
Yeah.
And that's like one of the most sought after Spawn issues because it's the first appearance of Angela. So I still remember getting that because I love that you mentioned that you ordered your comics through the mail. Was that American Entertainment?
You
because
know what?
I did that too.
Was it?
It might have been.
It could have been. I'm trying to summon it to, look, we're from like similar area. It probably was.
Yeah.
That's not part of the story I had been thinking through recently, but I'm sure I can find out for next time.
Well, it doesn't matter. I mean, I was just curious if it was.
No, but I mean, that's the
a lot of
thing.
sense. Yeah, and it's also just because of the fact that that was sort of like the eBay and the Amazon.com that it is now, as it was then for comic book readers, because when you go to a comic book store and you're searching for back issues, it's a gamble. You never know if you're going to be able to find what you find. Now, when you and I went to our local store, Oh Yeah Comics, we found a couple of gems sitting in there.
We sure did.
I'm so glad to know that you have a copy of X-Men 30, The Wedding of Cyclops and Jean Grey. That's a great issue. And
actually, yeah. Hold on, if we're holding stuff up, give me a second. That's one of the ones that I have over here. Yeah, here we go. Here we go. That's one that I have. Just a fun, and it's another one of those things. Look, similar to something. It's something that it's of value. It's a sentimental value. It's an enjoyment value. This is not one of those books that I'm like, oh yeah, someday. Yeah, you know, that's not how you think about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's also amazing because you mentioned the 90s and the fact that because they were so mass produced, it's so easy to get your hand on them for good prices. I mean, that's why I still cannot get over the prices that I paid to complete, you know, the entirety of Nightfall, except for that one specific issue that you and I know all too well about.
I know.
And also to complete Reign of the Supermen. I still couldn't believe that I was able to find an unbagged copy, first printing of Superman 75, which is the death of Superman. At one point in time, that specific issue, whether it was the unbagged version or the bagged version, that thing was running for like $100 or more. And now you can get it for like $250.
And look, I mean, if you think about it, it's funny because that really is a factor in collecting. The 90s things were so printed. I think I spent more on, another thing that you were helping me kind of find when I was picking up the first story arc of Ms. Marvel with Kamala Khan. Like, this definitely cost me more than Sandman 50. But not breaking the bank. Don't get me wrong. It's not like that. But, these things, the value is what it is. Like,
unfortunately, Ultimate Fallout 4 is unfortunately breaking the bank. But I'm still looking at it for you. I'm still searching for you.
I know, that's one of those ones that I keep having in the back of my mind. That would be pretty cool to own, but that's one of those ones where it's like,
Yeah, just in case you all don't know, if you're new to comics in general, Ultimate Fallout 4 is the first appearance of Miles Morales. So all of you Into the Spider-Verse fans, that's why that comic is so valuable
that's why it's
right
so
now.
Crazy expensive.
Exactly. I don't know if the current state of DC Comics with Future State, I know that Yara Flor, the Brazilian Wonder Woman, is apparently being touted as the DC's version of Miles Morales, but who knows what will happen as time goes on.
Oh, yeah.
But I did read Wonder Woman #1, and when Dan returns again, we will be talking about DC Future State.
Nice.
Now let's get into some really great questions. Let's talk a little bit more about some of your favorite titles. If you could give me, off the top of your head, your top 3, what would they be?
Obviously, ongoing, long-running comic series, just Batman.
I'm going to agree with you and put Batman in there as well. I've read some great Batman stories in the last couple of years.
Yeah. I'm sitting here trying to decide, because it's like Batman is very easy. And then it gets very tricky because I feel like after Batman, suddenly I'm deciding who to cut as opposed to who to say. So I'll definitely say ongoing Thor. I don't think this will shock you, but in needing to limit myself and come up with 3, I'll say X-Men.
Yeah, I mean, X-Men, and by X-Men, we pretty much mean the laundry list of titles that goes with the X.
There's too much there. There's too many branches of the story. And look, that goes with things like Batman, Detective Comics. Like, it's like, I'm kind of just talking about like the trajectory of character over time and those kinds. Like, if we're not limiting it to like a particular story or an arc, like, you got to go broad with these things. So yeah, X-Force, X-Factor, you get where I'm coming at this.
Absolutely. And I'm definitely going to agree with you on 2 of those 3. I mean, Batman, is just beloved by so many people just because of the fact that he is unlike any other superhero, whether it's in DC or just superheroes in general, because he's one of the most popular names in superhero world, and yet he's not a person with superpowers.
Right.
That's what people love so much about him. But also, people love his rogues gallery. He's got some of the greatest villains known to man.
That's the selling point for me personally.
And whether it's not just that, it's also all the great names that have been attached, whether it's Bill Finger and Bob Kane, who created him, to the 90s when I was first reading Batman and reading the books that were written by Chuck Dixon and drawn by Kelly Jones, just absolutely beautiful pieces of storytelling. And then you go into the world of Batman now, whether it was Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo in the New 52 era, or whether you love him or hate him, Tom King when he started the Rebirth era, or now the current James Tynion, who just wrote the epic story Joker War. And not just that, even those mini-series.
We already talked about Frank Miller. And, look, the thing about Batman is, it's like you go through, you say he has a great rogues gallery, he's got a great writers gallery. Like, everybody who is anybody, the thing that they've always wanted to do is take their shot at writing the Batman character, and also their shot at writing the Joker character. Like,
Absolutely.
Alan Moore, and like
Yeah, exactly. And I'm definitely going to agree with you on X-Men. And once again, that's just because of Chris Claremont. He set the bar when it comes to telling stories in the world of comics. Like, he was not afraid to go as dark as he did. He was not afraid to kill off a character or two. And, you know, he created some of the greatest and most legendary stories in comic book history. You know, Dark Phoenix Saga, Inferno, Mutant Massacre, Fall of the Mutants, and then Scott Lobdell just took it, and Jeff Loeb signed on alongside him to create stories like Executioner Song and one of my personal favorites, Fatal Attractions.
Yeah.
Great story. And even the Age of Apocalypse. There are a lot of Age of Apocalypse fans out there. Now, I know that right now, where the X-Men have gone, there's a real love-hate relationship with Hickman's world, but I'm not going to deny the fact that the thing about Hickman's X-Men story run is that it's different and it's intriguing. But it's all a matter of also just getting those great writers to really stick those landings. And right now, there are a real mixed bag of attitudes.
Right.
And if I'm going to give you a third comic book that I enjoy with a specific character, I would say Spawn, but I'm not going to, and that's just because of the fact that it's definitely Green Lantern.
Yeah.
Green Lantern, outside of the specific story of Blackest Night, I just love all the Green Lantern comics that I have read in these recent years. You know, Ron Mars introducing Kyle Rayner, and of course, Jeff Johns being the wonderkin that he was, alongside greats like Peter Tomasi and Ivan Reis and Ethan Van Sciver, just really giving us true richness and also really making Hal Jordan relevant again. And it even carried on after Blackest Night and Brightest Day into the New 52 era. We got great stories like The Rise of the Third Army and The Wrath of the First Lantern. And then Robert Venditti took over Jeff Johns' place in Green Lantern lore, and he just took it to new heights. I think that Robert Venditti is one of the strongest authors in comic books today. And there's also a lot of people who really appreciated what Grant Morrison has done for the last 2 years. I don't really know what Jeff Thorne is going to do with Green Lantern when he officially takes it over, because he's now writing Green Lantern Future State, and people like it, people don't like it, some find fun with it, you know, whatever. But what I really appreciated about Green Lantern was it's just gotten me to love all these characters. Like, I always knew that they existed, and I've always been a Kyle Rayner fan just because he was the first Green Lantern that I actually got exposed to. And I just love the fact that he was a cartoonist in his real world in comic books. But I've gotten a massive soft spot in recent days for Guy Gardner. I love his character. He's such a hothead, and I love it. I really wish that we could get more of him. And I know that thanks to Jeff Thorne, when we finally get into DC's Infinite Frontier in March, we're going to get a very strong John Stewart, which is also something that DC Comics has been lacking. And I just hope he does a good job. But also there's some newer Green Lanterns that people really want to learn more about. Like, people want more Simon Baz. People want more Jessica Cruz. There's so many great characters in the Green Lantern lore that people want more of. And I'm hoping that that's what we will get in the coming months.
Steve, it's really funny that you feel conflicted coming up with the three. You're such a huge Green Lantern fan.
I know.
That was such an obvious pick to me for you, and you're there like, gotta narrow it to three. What's that third one gonna be? I'm like, come on, bro. You know what it is.
And you would know this because you and your wife got me a Green Lantern shirt. So the next question that I want to ask you is, we've been talking a lot about comic books, specifically the superhero genre. Now, you specifically mentioned Sandman, and that's where I think this conversation will go, and that is, was that your very first exposure to the comic book world when it comes to non-superhero stories?
I'm going to say yes and no.
Okay.
So what I think I consider, and I don't know if this is, you know, germane to the discussion that you had originally planned on having today, but something that I think is really worth mentioning about my background that I alluded to earlier is I think outside of the traditional superhero comic genre, my first exposure to things aside from that is definitely manga and stories from Japan. And
Okay.
so the example I have of that is issue 1 of the America pressing of Shonen Jump when they brought this series over here. This was in, I think it was 2000. It probably says on it. I think it was 2003. This is dated as 2003.
Okay.
So I think that would be my first exposure to something that is not a traditional superhero story. And I kept up with like all of the series that they would do in monthly Jump, which is essentially what we were getting here. They just started all the arcs at the beginning instead of giving us exactly what was being printed in Japan. And so that's my answer for that. And I've read a lot of manga series over the years, but so I said yes and no. So to the yes part of it, yes, Sandman is an easy answer for that when you're talking about American comics. And this is kind of what I think of like in my superhero background. This is my silver age of comics here. So if my golden age is original Batman runs, traditional superhero stories, the things that my dad introduced me to, I found Sandman when I was in college. So that was after the series had already been completed. And I picked up this trade paperback of the first issues. This is issues 1 through 8, I think, are in here, of Sandman from the campus bookstore at school. I forget why it caught my attention, but that was a time I started reading a lot of classic story arcs around that time that I had missed, things that were notable series in the 80s and 90s that I was kind of going back to and reading that was sort of a gap in my knowledge. And so I found Sandman, again, not a traditional superhero story, but a story that's incredibly close to me. I mean, I held up my issue 50 recently. I think Sandman, when all is said and done, that series may be my favorite comic thing. It's hard to have an answer to that kind of question. But I mean, my love for Neil Gaiman knows like no bounds. So
Right.
that definitely jumps to mind. That's why I had it pre-pulled from my shelf to be able to hold
Right.
up, because I knew I'd be mentioning that at some point.
Let me just say I'm really glad you mentioned Shonen Jump, because when I did my first show with Dan very recently, we had a comment in the premiere comment section asking, are you going to talk about manga? And so I'm just like, thank God Andy did this, because I would like to bring some more manga into some of these conversations. There definitely is room for it, and it's only because of the fact that I'm not a manga reader, but I'm an anime watcher.
Steve, this is very funny. I don't think I've ever told you this. I own every single US printed Shonen Jump.
Wow. That's awesome.
Here's the first one. I have every single one. I have the like issue 0 that they previewed it, that they were giving out for free at comic book shops in the months leading up to this one too. I have actually every single issue.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit more nitpicky when it comes to the anime that I watch. I mean, I think what's really funny to me is the fact that, I'm a typical guy, but I'm not the one that really goes towards, the mechas or the action stories like Full Metal Alchemy. Honestly, I love the romantic comedies. I like Love Hina. I like Ranma One Half.
I know all that stuff.
I love that. One of my favorite animes is one that some people don't even know much about, and that is the Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, and to a certain degree, Princess Nine, which I absolutely love because it's about baseball. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's the beauty of anime and manga, because I still remember when I watched the special features on my copy of the Animatrix, and they talked about why manga and anime are so popular. And it's just because of the fact that they write stories about anything and everything.
That's very true.
And considering the fact that you can go from like people powering gigantic robots with their minds to a guy who is trying to get into college and just trying to make wages by running an all-girls dormitory house. Like, it's just amazing where you can go in these crazy vast worlds.
Well, look, just short answer to the viewer who wrote that comment. I can talk about Shonen Jump is the short answer.
Let me just say you're gonna have to drive those episodes
That's
if we
fine.
do that. I think that's what
Steve,
we're gonna
that's
have
one
to
thing
do.
I'm very comfortable with doing.
Well, anyway,
Yeah.
my first exposure to non-superhero stories actually came around the end of my earlier stages of reading comics when I was a kid, and then I took my long hiatus. To a certain degree, it might have been a little bit before that because it could have started with a superhero story, which is very well known to many, and that is Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross's Marvels, which even though the superheroes are in the story, it's a human perspective on the viewing of superheroes in their world.
Yeah.
But the true steering clear of superheroes in comic books came to me when I fell in love with a certain writer who goes by the name of Garth Ennis.
Okay.
And I had been reading The Darkness, but I started to pick up some of his Vertigo miniseries. So I picked up a one-shot called Heartland, which I only recently found out is a spin-off of Hellblazer. Never would have thought about that in my wildest dreams. And then I picked up two more of the series that he wrote. I picked up this series called The Unknown Soldier, and I also picked up a story called Pride and Joy. Unknown Soldier was about a mysterious bandaged-faced soldier who was suffering from a great deal of PTSD, and Pride and Joy was the story about a former bounty hunter trying to keep his daughter safe. Very, very powerful stories. But also, another story that I picked up was in the vein of Alex Ross. It was a story called Uncle Sam. It literally came out about a year after Kingdom Come, 2 books. And what I loved so much about it was the story of this bum on the streets of New York who was basically a guy who was constantly hallucinating, and he looked just like Uncle Sam, like a ratted old version of Uncle Sam who pissed his pants and just like had faded colors. But he was getting all of these crazy visions of the darkest chapters of American history. So I thought that that was such an interesting story to read. But yeah, that was my exposure to comic books and realizing that there are other things besides the fantasy and superheroes. You can still have some fantasy elements roped into some of these titles, but let's just say, and I'm going to be talking about this a great deal in the coming months, the indie titles and the indie stories that are coming out in 2019, 2020, 2021, those are just exciting me so much more than the typical superhero stories. And even the ones that are about superheroes are changing the whole story of the superhero, which I love.
Yeah, I know. And we've been talking about that a little bit too. And there's a bunch of series. These are things we'll probably talk about in later episodes, but there's many that you have mentioned to me that have caught my attention. And I know, you know, I've kind of been in a little bit of a slow time of reading current new releases. But there's a lot of stuff that I'm very excited about. But I don't have to go into detail on some of those. I've already bought a couple of them, like getting ahead of myself, thinking, all right, I'm gonna do this. But yeah.
Truth be told, we hope that, meaning Dan and I, we hope that you will sort of catch up to us, because we would like to have you cross over to the other side and talk about a month of comics one day with us.
I know. And I'm just looking, I have my phone. So I read a lot of digital comics. It's worth mentioning too. You know, and I have my phone in front of me and I just see, yep, I had bought We Only Find Them When They're Dead. I told myself this is something I'm excited about. I would like to read it for a lot of reasons. I haven't gotten to it yet, but look, there's a lot of these kind of shorter series or newer books or things outside of the, you know, current zeitgeist mainstream that I'm very excited about. We'll get through it. We'll talk about it.
So what was the very first truly grand epic comic book story that you ever read?
Dark Phoenix Saga.
You know what's really funny? I haven't read that yet.
Yeah, I think that came up a while ago, and I remember thinking, yeah, no, Dark Phoenix Saga. I remember, so I have always gone to comic conventions with my dad, and to the point now, that I am a big person. I tend to buy my dad a ticket to New York Comic Con on his birthday. The timing kind of lines up really well, and I always go myself too. But Dark Phoenix Saga, that was one of the first comic conventions he took me to. I think it was Big Apple Comic Con.
Okay.
And so I forget what year that would have been, but we were looking around, looking at the booths, and like I was already an X-Men fan, both from, you already mentioned the animated series and from the books that he had that I had read. And he got me the trade paperback collection of Dark Phoenix Saga just because I was looking at a lot of X-Men stuff. And he said, this is a good one. You're going to like this one. So Dark Phoenix Saga is the easy answer for me on that one.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to me and my current comic book collecting style, it's just like there are certain titles or storylines, if you will. It's like, okay, these specific storylines, I don't think I'm going to hunt down the originals just because of the fact that I really wasn't collecting them at that age. Now, bear in mind, when we get a little bit more into the next question, I did actually start to hunt down some of the old Claremont stories, but only because I was really surprised by how inexpensive it was to collect each individual issue. Now, as the entire collection, that's a whole other story, but Dark Phoenix Saga, Days of Future Past, like I'll read those two eventually because I know they're so significant, but I'm not going to hunt down those issues just because, but some of the things that I've been talking about in terms of some of those grails. Like, I was an idiot to stop collecting when I did because I need to read Long Halloween. I need to read Hush. I'm going to try and get my hands on the original books no matter how much they cost. I mean, right now, the Long Halloween
I looked myself just for the hell of it because I reread Long Halloween recently. I've got the trade paperback of it on my shelf, and that's one of those like Silver Age of Andy stories. That was one of the ones I read while I was in college that I went back to. And actually, you mentioned Hush. Hush was one of them too. And that's what we say about collecting, right? So like there's certain older stories that you love them, you're interested in, but you're not necessarily interested in getting the individual issues because we don't collect to collect. We collect because there's meaning and value outside of the dollar value. So if there's something that you think this is kind of cool, you don't want to drop $100 on it. But when you think this is something I remember from when I was a kid and I went to the store and I looked at this on the shelf and I never ended up buying, like those are the kind of things that we're really talking about when we talk about collecting.
And I didn't actually mention this to you before at any point, but ever since I actually saw the animated film adaptation, I don't know how much it's going to cost me, but I definitely need to get the original 3 copies. I need to get my hands on Mark Millar's Red Sun because that movie is amazing, and I would love to read the original story.
I don't have a damn clue what those are going for.
I've seen them, and it's not pretty, but hopefully the price will go down at some point.
Whenever they take these stories and repurpose them in other media, it always makes the comic book price just like shoot up, with the exception of, Age of Apocalypse.
Yeah, I'm going to say that when it comes to the first epic story that I read, it's even though, the first comic books that I read were Executioner Song,
right.
That's a pretty epic story, but then I read Fatal Attractions. There was something high above that just because of all of the landmark events that took place in those 5 issues alone. I mean, Colossus leaves the X-Men. Magneto gets his brain fried by Professor Xavier, which would lead to the Onslaught Saga literally a few years later. Wolverine got the adamantium ripped out of his skeleton by Magneto to the end of the story where Wolverine actually leaves the X-Men. There were just so many ground-shaking moments that just shook the comic book fans to their cores. And that's why I feel that was the first epic story. Now, granted, literally within that time frame, I was also reading Reign of the Superman, Death of Superman, and Nightfall all at the same time. But there was just something about that story.
I understand.
I think it was just because it didn't just have one major game-changing event. It had multiple.
It was an avalanche. Yeah.
And in just 5 issues.
Yes.
Whereas how many issues are those 2 other stories that I
was going to say? It's a little different.
Exactly. So the question is, it's actually 2 questions, and I'm going to actually rope them in together.
Sure.
So did you have a slow period of time when you just stopped reading? And how did you get back in if that was the case?
So
I'm curious to know.
I've had two, and that's why I already mentioned, like Silver Age Andy in college, right? So, the gap between Bronze, like little kid reading some of these stories, primarily what was recommended by my dad, and Silver Age was I didn't read a ton in high school. I still read comics, no ongoing series, but it's a thing. I never had a dry period like away from these things because I feel like nerd culture started to become more and more mainstreamed and in pop culture. So I was still exposed to superhero movies. I was reading manga for most of that time. I'm thinking that of a little separate, right? And also video games, and always been a fan of superhero video games. I think of like the Spider-Man 2 video game for PlayStation 2 that a lot of people remember very fondly that was tied in with the Raimi film. And then there was another period kind of after college when I had started working. I was picking up a lot of Neil Gaiman because I got into him through Sandman.
Right.
So also reading his novels and his short stories. But not as much comics for a while. And what I credit to me getting back into comics, which is now fairly recently, I say recently, but time is crazy. I guess this is a few years now. When Marvel relaunched the Star Wars series around the time that Force Awakens was coming out,
Right.
I was very interested in reading the beginning of that and picking up that series. So went to Midtown Comics on a lunch break and picked it up. And then that led me to reading a lot, and that led me to getting into Marvel. So it's interesting, even though the Marvel Cinematic Universe had been so big, and I'd been watching that stuff. Like I said, I've never been away from comic culture. It's just the series, right? Reading Star Wars, going to Midtown Comics regularly to kind of pick up these issues, that got me into a lot of stuff. And then I hit one of my heaviest periods of reading with ongoing series, reading Jason Aaron's Thor, and that, oh boy, loving that, going back a little bit to read everything I had missed in the lead up to what was coming out. I guess that was like 2014, 2015,
something like that,
whatever. But I like going back to like 2010, 2012, whenever it was they started writing it, catching up. I started reading ongoing Daredevil. I started reading Doctor Strange. I started reading Ms. Marvel, which is a huge one for me. And it's one of those things where I kind of caught myself back up too. So I didn't just kind of start diving in right there, but I read some of like these big authors who were not names that were super familiar to me because of when I had kind of stopped, but are now titans in the industry, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and some of them I think we'll probably talk about maybe on one of those ones where Daniel will be joining us.
For sure. Yeah. It's unfortunately, though, because you mentioned Jason Aaron, he's like one of the most hated people in comic books right now because apparently he is literally ruining the Avengers at the moment.
Yeah, loved a lot. So, and I'll also say, you might technically say that I'm currently in like a little bit of not reading it. I've not have the time I've wanted to read. The last time I read a lot of comics was around War of the Realms. Since picked up a bunch of comics and read a couple issues of a few series, but I'm not back up to full steam like I had been all that time. So yeah, I've read some of Jason Aaron's run of Avengers, but not all of it. And actually, I don't know where all of the negativity started because where I was reading from, I loved it. So let's just be open about that.
No, first of all, you're not alone on that. I can actually show you after the show. I'm going to send you a video of one of the channels that I watch, Wes over at Thinking Critical. He specifically mentions where Jason Aaron's Avengers run goes sour.
Okay, interested to see where that is and if it's past where I had fallen off before. But I'll be jumping back on.
And as someone who recommended War of the Realms to me, and I enjoyed that story based on what I read, then reading Jason Aaron's Age of Khonshu, which the only reason why I picked it up was because it was mentioned that it was going to happen towards the end of War of the Realms.
Right.
And not appreciating it for what it was. Am I upset over the fact that I bought the comics? No, I'm not, because at some point in time, my attitude is I will reread my copies of War of the Realms, and obviously I will reread Age of Khonshu, because it's part of it. What's currently being written right now, which was basically the story that leads right into it, right after the Age of Khonshu, Enter the Phoenix, I am not touching that with a 10-foot pole, because apparently no one has anything good to say about it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, jumping back into like me coming back out of like my period of not reading as many comics, trying to see, I'm sure I have it here. Oh yeah, so I jumped back in. It was also around the time Max Bemis picked up writing Moon Knight. And so you talk about Age of Khonshu. I have not read Age of Khonshu, as I think you probably are aware, but I got very into Moon Knight thanks to Max Bemis's short run, which was awesome and added so much to the character. And I hope that while he's a creative guy and I'll always follow whatever he does, I hope that he turns back to the character at some point.
Well, I'll just let you know that there was a big announcement that actually happened in comics just this past week, and that was the announcement that Donnie Cates and Ryan Stegman are officially concluding their run on Venom with the legacy numbering of Venom number 200, which is going to be Venom's current series number 35.
Yeah.
People don't know where are they going next. A lot of people are saying, I hope they write and draw Moon Knight.
Wouldn't that be awesome? Wouldn't that be absolutely awesome?
There are so many things that people are saying. There are so many directions that those two guys can go. Some people said, can they write Moon Knight? Will they write Spider-Man? Will they write Ghost Rider? Will they write Silver Surfer? Because Donnie Cates' Silver Surfer Black is one of the coolest and most beautiful pieces of comic writing and artistry that I have ever read.
Donnie Cates is someone we can talk about too.
Or
just thinking about the future.
Cates just going to stay continuing on with Thor. We don't know if he's going to end his Thor run at this point in time. There's a lot of directions that those two guys as a creative team can go, and they haven't gotten the announcement just yet. So there's just a lot of speculation right now. Yeah. So
tell me about yours. You know, sorry, we get sidetracked. We go on. Tell me about yours.
No, that's the point of this show. Because we discuss, we have conversation. That's what's supposed to happen here. Anyway, so my story is very interesting because it was around 1998, 1999, maybe even earlier that, maybe 1997. I just didn't want to read comics anymore. I don't know what it was that triggered it. I wasn't really connecting with my friend who got me into collecting comic books because he ended up going to college in a different place and I went to a different college. Now, Daniel and I had been collecting comics together as friends for a while, but even around that time, Daniel stopped reading as well. We just really weren't finding anything that was truly grabbing us. And I don't know why, considering the fact that I literally let The Long Halloween pass me by around that time, and now I'm literally kicking myself in the ass, knowing how much money I'm going to shell out to get those original 13 books. But I still, like you, was very much invested in the popular culture that was comic book culture because Bruce Timm was making more shows beyond Batman the Animated Series. Superman the Animated Series, love it. Batman Beyond, love it. Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, love it. Didn't watch Teen Titans, but honestly, I might actually reconsider it. But
you should. That's one I've watched. You'll enjoy it. You will.
But then came that gigantic library that we have right now. That is the DC animated original films. So I've actually been saying to people, those and shows that came out like Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes and the HBO short-lived Spawn animated series, which you, sir, still need to watch. You have no idea what you're missing. And then, of course, all of the current Marvel and DC movies that are coming out. Those, to a certain degree, became my comic books.
And also, Steve, don't talk up the DC animated movies too much, because if you think you can't afford The Long Halloween now,
why do you think I want to get it before May?
I know. As soon as that drops.
I know. That's why. That's the reason why. Like the minute I found out that that was going to be one of the newer animated movies this year,
You were like, yeah,
late summer, early fall, I'm like, gotta
done.
go, gotta get
Done.
them. I don't care how much it costs.
Yeah.
I'm willing to shell out the $200 if that's what it's going to cost.
It's your only chance.
It's gonna be my last chance. It's true. I also knew during this time frame, so we're literally talking about from 1999 to 2018. That's a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't until my wife and I went to go visit her parents, and they live in Pennsylvania, very close to Philly, and the Franklin Institute, even though that really is a children's museum, there was a special Marvel exhibit. And this was also around the time that the MCU's Phase 1 was going towards its conclusion. Like the Infinity Saga was about to end with Endgame, or maybe it might have already just ended. I think it actually had just ended. So I went to this exhibit and I had a blast just seeing all of these really amazing things there. But then as I kept going through the exhibit, something caught my eye. It was at the X-Men display, and on that display, there were 3 comic books that were X-Men comic books, and they weren't old X-Men comic books. We're talking comic books from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And all of a sudden, I look closely, and I see this copy of X-Men on that display case, and I'm like, my exact words were, holy shit, I actually own that book. And then this nostalgia tsunami just wafted over my head, practically drowning me. And the next day I turned to my wife and said, listen, I'm going into my own personal accounts with my own money. And I said, I want to start collecting comic books again. I just think that it's something that I need to do because, like I said earlier, even though I wasn't reading them, I was still hearing about what was going on in comic books. I mean, I've mentioned Blackest Night already. I had been wanting to get my hands on some way to read Blackest Night for years because I knew that if I never read that, I was going to miss out on a crazy story. And also read all of those crisis stories that came out, like Identity Crisis, Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, the Green Lantern Rebirth, the Flash Rebirth, so many great stories. And going into things like Marvel, like I hadn't read Civil War, I hadn't read House of M, I hadn't read the Messiah trilogy. There were just all of these excellent stories in Marvel and DC, and even in some of the indie titles that I knew that one day I was going to have to try and get my hands on them and read them. And let's just say, thanks to that Marvel exhibit, the time was now. So I just started hunting down back issues. And this was also around the time that you and I actually had built a very strong friendship. And
I was very aware of all of this. We've known each other for longer than I realize now, particularly because this past year has been so strange with the sense of time. But this was all happening like after we had become friends. So I was very aware as this journey began. So, I mean, access to your Google Sheets with your list of things you were targeting, you know, all of that. So I'm so aware.
Oh, and believe me, Daniel has been taking true advantage of that because now he knows what books he needs to go out and buy.
Yep, it's true.
Not saying that he has to follow me foot for foot, but
down that rabbit hole, but
yeah, but it's like he does know what I'm collecting one way or another. And I love sharing my hauls with you both on my cell phone every single Wednesday. It's so much fun.
I do too.
Daniel and I are hoping that one day we're going to get a screenshot from your collection.
Hell yeah. Well, you know, it's like I said, I do so much digital reading too, but also I credit that with me catching back up to a certain extent because services like Marvel Unlimited and Comixology really help for catching you up if there's a current ongoing story you've been hearing about and you're excited about. I see a lot of value in that, even if you just kind of like purchase it for 1 month and then do a bunch of reading like on your phone or your computer. And then you're like, all right, next Wednesday, here we go. And you can start to buy them. So I kind of see myself, you know, call that a sneak preview of what the next couple months are going to look like for me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also loved that at that point we were actually going to local comic book stores and we were going to our local mall. And now that there's a Newberry Comics there, it's really, really cool. You know, the last time I went to Newberry Comics, which was very, very recently, I actually did buy a comic book there.
Nice.
Yeah, because it was one of the brand new X titles, and Al Ewing is writing it. It's Sword. I did get the last copy from the local comic book store that we go to, but it was a variant cover. And Daniel and I have had this conversation so many times. He says to me, like, when it comes to collectors, they usually like to go for the non-variants.
Right.
So I went to the comic book store just to hang out there in Newberry, and there was a stack of Sword #1s, regular cover. I was like, why not?
Yeah, yeah.
But getting back to what I was saying, so I just started truly getting back in. I started with just collecting so many back issues because I wanted to play catch up as well. I wanted to read all of these great stories.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I was saying to myself, I don't know if I'm going to want to get anything new. But along with reading a lot of backstories, that was when I also discovered the comic book community here on YouTube. And let me tell you something, sir, it is vast. There are some great channels, and there's a great variety. There's people that want to talk about just the current comic news, but then there's also channels like Comics Explained that likes to talk about some of these stories. And I love the way that he talks about these stories, because I know I shared the Blackest Night story with you.
You did, yeah.
And I like how he really tells you where you need to go and what you need to read. Like, I think the best example was the Blackest Night story, and he said you could read just the core story, and even though there's a ton of tie-ins, he says read just the Green Lantern and the Green Lantern core tie-ins for Blackest Night and Brightest Day, because they really are great. And he wasn't wrong. They're great stories. But it wasn't until September of 2019 where the big news dropped, and it was the fact that a certain landmark record-breaking comic had just come out, and it was called Spawn issue 300, that basically not only got so many people excited, but also sold more copies than the J.J. Abrams and Sons Spider-Man 1 book. That says a lot. And as someone who was a proud owner of the first 10 issues of Spawn, first printing, everybody, I said to myself, maybe I should read some more Spawn. And let's just say I took the red pill and I saw how deep the rabbit hole goes. And let me just say, it's still going. And I also have to say, I really picked a great time to get back into reading comics.
Oh, yeah.
Because if it wasn't for comic books, I think that 2020 would have broke me. Because
I hear you.
It was a very tough year. And
it was?
Yeah. Wow. Is it sarcasm day at Camp Stupid today? I'm not sure.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Because I wasn't able to spend time with so many people, and you and I were trying to save our sanity by talking to each other as much as we possibly could. The fact that I was able to just dive into all of these great stories and just, like, when there was nothing else to do, just take a stack of like 20 to 30 comics, bring them upstairs to my desk in my office, and just read. It was a saving grace, and it relieved so much of my stresses.
Yeah.
And look, I don't want to get into these conversations in greater detail, but if they really do not kick up the vaccination rollout in the next week or two, then, ladies and gentlemen, expect another year of this crap, which I'm not excited about.
I know.
Yeah, because I don't think, because the truth really is, like, when it comes to all of our leaders, regardless of what political party you follow, like, how badly do you want the economy to collapse? Seriously, people, what do you want? So they've really got to do something, you know? So we'll see what happens. But anyway, it's been great getting back into comics. I have been reading so many great stories. I have started to really get into understanding and learning about some of these other big names in writing and artistry. You know, like when I was younger, the names like Alex Ross, Mark Waid, Mark Millar, Peter David, Garth Ennis, when those names, Todd McFarlane, when those names pop up, I ran for them.
You knew, yeah.
And it's still those names, but you now can add names like Chip Zdarsky, James Tynan, Al Ewing. There's so many new names in my world that I'm being exposed to. And thank God, because some of these stories are just amazing, especially some of these indie titles. And even comic book names that I never collected a comic book of, but I know the legacy that they have. I mean, one of the most sought-after comics that came out last year is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Last Ronin, because Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird are attached to that book. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but...
No, I have not, no.
Daniel and I will be talking about it very, very soon, because issue number 2 of 5 is finally coming out to the market. And let me just tell you, we're all dying for it.
I know. And that's one we've even talked about a little bit, but no, I haven't read that one.
Yeah, so now speaking of those, let's get into the next question, and that is, currently, what are you reading that you're absolutely loving, and what are you planning to read very soon that you're just excited about?
Yeah, well, since I haven't been reading a lot these last couple months, the thing that primarily jumps to mind is I did just read Three Jokers. I did really enjoy Three Jokers, and I won't talk about that today because I will talk about that another time.
Yep.
What do I want to read, and what am I thinking about reading, though? You know, there's a bunch of series some that I've mentioned already that I want to dive back into, catch up with, and also see where they are. And so that does include Thor, Daredevil. Also, there's older things that I haven't read that I want to.
Me too.
You know, I mentioned earlier, like, how useful I think tools like Marvel Unlimited are. Like, I still need to read Blackest Night, which you've already mentioned on this episode today. So that's something that's squarely on my radar that I want to look at. So yeah, I mean, the thing is, there's a lot of stuff, and I'm excited to read it all, and I'm looking forward to it. But that's the short answer.
I've already done one episode of That's Comical, and my first episode of my other new show, The Old, the New, and the Awesome, and I've mentioned this book already on both of those episodes. And as they always say, third time's a charm. Read Robert Venditti's Hawkman.
Okay. Yeah, and we've talked about that too. Yeah, I know.
That is one of the most beautiful comic book runs that I have read. It is just a gorgeous piece of writing. It really is a masterpiece. And I didn't even read the whole run. But what I read, I loved. It was just beautiful. Beautiful
That's
writing.
That's a good one for the list.
It's really gotten me, because I always knew who Robert Venditti was when I first read his Green Lantern story, Lights Out, and I haven't really read more of Robert Venditti, but I like his writing style. And after reading Hawkman, I'm just saying to myself, where's he going next? Whatever he's writing next, I will read. Because there are people just hoping that the next thing that he's allowed to write for DC, people are praying for a brand new JSA run. If he is going to write it, let's just say that I will be first in line to pick it up.
Nice.
Yeah, what am I not reading? That's I think really the question in my world. But no, I think the best stuff that I'm reading right now that I'm absolutely loving are all of these indie books. Like I'm about to wrap up We Only Find Them When They're Dead. That's the last issue of the story now. Apparently what I have heard is that Al Ewing is signed on for 12 issues, so we may be getting a book 2, which I'm really excited about. I'm in the middle of this great indie title called Erratic, which is like a whole new take on the teenage superhero. James Tynan's Department of Truth, which is fantastic. Chip Zdarsky's Stillwater, which is incredible. And when it comes to some of the current, more popular names, honestly, I'm sort of on a pause right there. I mean, I am reading some of DC's Future State, and I've got to say what's really surprised me is Tamaki's Dark Detective. She's really surprised me with issue number 1, but I'm very curious to see how she's going to conclude it, especially considering that she is now officially going to be writing Detective Comics when Future State is over.
Mm-hmm.
But it really is the indie titles that are grabbing me more than the big two companies.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many titles that I am excited for. February is going to be such a big month because we've got Radiant Black coming out. We've got Stray Dogs coming out. We've got, in 2 months, we've got a brand new Jeff Johns Image title called Geiger, which I'm really excited about. Keanu Reeves' Boom Studios book, Berserker, which I'm really excited to read. Obviously, continuing on with The Last Ronin, I even found a title from Dynamite that I actually will want to show my father, who doesn't read comic books. But Dynamite Comics is writing James Bond, Agent of Spectre. And I'm a big James Bond fan, so I'm really excited to see what this book is going to be all about. And I'm also going to be continuing on with The King in Black, because that's going to go pretty much until March and April. I'm also going to be reading the rest of Thor. I don't know how much longer I will be. And yes, I do still pick up an X title or two, because we are in the middle of Reign of X, and there are a couple of stories that they're writing that I am interested in. So it's little things here and there when it comes to the big two, but when it comes to indie titles, I'm looking for anything and everything. Like, there's a really interesting story coming out at the end of March from Image Comics called Two Moons. It takes place during the Civil War, and it's about a Native American who is fighting for the Union, and all of a sudden, like, these latent shamanistic powers just erupt in him, and he sees more doom and gloom beyond the war. So I'm just like, what is this? I've got to read this.
Yeah.
So the creativity that's going on right now, especially outside of Marvel and DC, is just incredible.
I know. I'm talking about, I'm primarily have been a digital comic reader, at least for the current things. And we had already mentioned We Only Find Them When They're Dead. That's one that's on my shared list as well. But yeah, I will be paying attention to more of these new releases as I turn to the new releases that you're talking about.
Yeah, I will say, though, I almost forgot to mention this. One of the Marvel books that has been surprising the hell out of me is Peter David's return to writing these Maestro miniseries. I actually got my hands on his original 1993 books of the Hulk Future Imperfect, and I loved it. But Maestro was the biggest surprise of 2020 for me, and they just started a continuation called Maestro War and Pax. It's great. It's just so much fun. And I highly recommend it. There was a really cool twist at the end of issue #1 of War and Pax. A certain infamous yet popular superhero villain pops up at the very end, and I was like, when I read it, like, let's just say it was like one of those classic cartoons where my jaw just like dropped down, and I was like, oh man, I can't wait for issue #2. So the last question before we conclude this episode and go into obviously what we will be discussing next time is, what do you think about comics today? Are they just as fun collecting them and reading them now than they were when you were younger?
Yes.
Answer.
Short answer. Yes. No, I think, and this is, you know, my refrain of nerd culture is pop culture. I feel like so much of what I enjoy has roots in what I have always enjoyed. You know, whether it's just, I mean, the quality of the stories are fantastic. I love seeing how comics have exploded into pop culture through movies and games as well. You know, there's obviously the element of nostalgia to it, even though these are new stories that I'm enjoying completely on their own for their own merit. And that connection, you know, nostalgia, not just for the comics, but the great relationship that I have to my dad and what he gave me in introducing me to all this stuff that just gives me so much happiness. So, you know, while we didn't get to go to Comic-Con this year, you know, I'm hopeful for the future. And at least these stories that we still have access to while we're at home are still so wonderful. So just as much joy. My connection with these books have changed, but the heart of what I enjoy about them has really always been the same. So just as good.
You know what's actually going to be very interesting? I'm going to actually say that being a collector now, I'm finding more value and fun in it than I did then. And I think it's just because of the fact that when I was younger, I was bullied. and nerd culture / current pop culture was not the popular thing when I was growing up. So it was like, yeah, you'd go to the comic book store and you'd be excited to bring home what you were reading, but at the same time, you were hoping that one of those kids that didn't really care much for you in school was not following you or spotting you in the comic book store, and then let's say, oh, look, there's the nerd, let's point and laugh, ha ha. You know, it's like, and this is also coming from someone who is rewatching Freaks and Geeks right now, because I have the complete series, so that really was me in elementary school. And like I said, I wasn't really reading that many comics after my sophomore year of high school, so I didn't get picked on for it, but it was still just not something that was, you know, really accepted. And I
wasn't
think,
a billion-dollar multimedia industry. You know, like...
Yeah, and I just think that because it has morphed into something that everybody loves right now, I mean, that could be a curse and a blessing all at the same time. But I also think what makes this time for me collecting comic books right now is just because of the fact that I actually have friends who just love it just as much as I do, and they want to talk about it. They want to share about it. The fact that YouTube seems to be the place where nerds galore just congregate and actually find each other and build friendships. The fact that when I was actually going to Midtown Comics as well, and we've even gone to Midtown Comics together because we both worked in the city, but the thing is, when I was going to get some of the new comics on New Comic Book Day, it was so weird to actually say to myself, wow, this line is not filled with kids. There are people in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s, in their 60s that are going out of this store with stacks of comic books. And that's one of the few things that I think when it comes to the big two, and we'll discuss this in a later episode, I think that's where they're struggling, because they're trying to build the next generation of fans, but at the same time, the people that are really the hardcore fans are the older generations. We're talking about people who are from the baby boomer generation all the way to the early stages of the millennial generation, pre-Gen Z. And everything that they think that Gen Z is going to like are things that are just not selling.
I'm looking forward to disagreeing with you on that episode. Well, that'll be a fun one.
I just think that the problem right now, especially with DC and Marvel, is they're just throwing so much shit up against the wall, and they're just waiting for something to stick.
And I think you've got it with DC and Marvel, though.
And one thing that I know about that is people who actually do that, that's the textbook definition of insanity. And when you listen to some of the dire news, especially that people seriously are saying that by the end of 2021, DC Comics may not be existing. You know, that's a sad thing to hear.
I know.
But we need to try and figure out why it's happening. Anyway, everybody, that's actually going to wrap up our very first topic section of That's Comical. Andy, I'm really glad that you were able to join me for this conversation. This was great. But before we officially conclude, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be really excited for our next episode, because we're going to be doing our first must-be-read episode, and that, of course, is going to be Jeff Johns's and Jason Fabok's Batman 3 Jokers, which, as far as I'm concerned, was probably one of the best, if not the best, comic book titles that was written in 2020. And I'm just really excited to go through these 3 books with you, Andy, and really discuss, you know, what made it such a great story. And the question I think we both can agree on that we will conclude with after that episode is, does it live up to some of those truly great Batman stories of the past couple of years?
Yeah, that's going to be a fun one. I'm really looking forward to talking about it. And, you know, it's very fresh in my mind. I read 3 Jokers not that long before this one. I'll have some time to digest it and think about it before we chat, but I'm looking forward to what that discussion is going to be like.
Are you actually interested in getting those books in physical form? Because I know that our comic book store still has all 3 of them.
Now that I've read them, yeah, I think I liked them enough.
And the last thing that I also want to say is, Andy's actually got another interesting internet project that he does participate in, and I would like him to promote it before we officially say goodbye for today.
Yeah, let me plug everything under the sun real quick. So first off, Steve mentioned we met through my wife, who also has a YouTube channel. So I definitely recommend people who are interested can find her at Blatantly Bookish on YouTube. And then for me, I have a number of projects. I am part of a Dungeons and Dragons podcast where we play 5th edition, and I play the Warlock Lazor, the lightly armored zapping hatted organic robot. You can find us on Twitter at the Dbags. Similar link on Instagram and Facebook as well. And you can just find me on Twitter at Hatted Robot after the character, as well as on Instagram at Andy_midnight_fire from my other project, which has been less active in 2020 because it's hard to be together. But my band, The Midnight Fire, who you can also find at Midnight Fire NY on Twitter.
And let me just say that that's one of the few things I'm really looking forward to when this pandemic officially comes to an end. Jen and I are really excited to come back to see one of your shows.
I am so
really
excited to play one of them.
we enjoyed it the first time. It was great to see everybody because when Andy and his wife got married, they sat me and my wife with the band.
Yeah.
And they were some of the most fun people that we were able to interact with at the wedding. And it was great to see some of them when we went to Andy's show. That was great. Yeah. And yeah, this was a really, really fun conversation, Andy. And I'm really glad that we're just really excited for the next one. So
yeah, it's an awesome time. Thank you for having me and looking forward to continuing to do these.
And once again, thank you so much for you and of course for Dan partnering up with me on this journey. I think we're going to have an excellent year. So thank you very much everybody for watching. All of the information that you need for both of us will be in the box below, but until then I will see you in the next one. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, feel free to leave a comment. Also, feel free to subscribe if you want to be up to date with our latest videos. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you in the next one. Actions speak louder than words.